Good morning, Zajac. How's the quality over here?
It's good. It's fine.
Okay, Baruch Hashem. Wow, today's really good. Wow. Let's get this up over here. A lot of stuff.
It's always good.
Okay. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning today's 3 Prakim Rambam. We are starting Hilchos Meiser. Let's read the header. Hilchos Meiser mitzvahs asay achas. There's one positive commandment. Vihi lahafresh Meiser Rishon, to separate what we call the first tithe, b'chol shana v'shana, every single year, mishnei hazariah, of the years when crops are grown. In other words, we are excluding the year of Shemitah, as we will see. Ubi in mitzvah. And we will expound this mitzvah. Again, today's 3 chapters will be Prakim Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. We are starting with Perek Rishon. We're starting with the first chapter. The first chapter, as usual, lays down the basic dinim, the basic rules of Meiser. The first chapter has 16 halachas, beginning with halacha Aleph, says the Rambam. After we separate Truma Gedola, as we explained, then mafresh echad ma'asorim min anisha. We separate 1 of 10%. V'zehu hanikra ma'aser rishon, and this is what's called the first ma'aser. U'bay nemar, and regarding this ma'aser, it says in Parshas Koirach, Kiyas Masad b'nei Yisrael, etc. And the Rambam begins by telling us that this ma'aser belongs to the Leviim, and given it's not gender related, whether it's to a male Levi, whether it's to a female Levi. As it says, the Levnei Levi, Hine Nosati, Kol Masad B'Yisrael, Lenachla, this is their inheritance. Halacha 2. Ma'aser Rishon, unlike Truma, that has Kedusha, Ma'aser Rishon has no Kedusha. In other words, it's the financial property of the Levium. But Mutar B'Achila Yisrael, it could be eaten by a Yid, by a non-Kohen, by a non-Levi. Now, obviously, one second, there's laws of theft. Of course, if it's given to a Levi, without a Levi giving it to a fellow Yid, of course, you're stealing his stuff. But there's no Kedusha in it. In other words, a Levi can gift it to a Yisrael. A Levi can sell it to an Yisrael. Another thing, since it has no Kedusha, it could be eaten even betruma. Whether the person is tamei, whether the food is tamei, unlike truma, that God forbid, may not be eaten betruma. She'ein boy Kedusha klal. Now, the question is that we do find regarding Meiser, the word Kodesh, we're going to have regarding Meiser the need at times to redeem it. If there's no Kedusha, how is it holy? Why does it need to be redeemed? So that's a very big thing. It says that whenever you read the word Kodesh, whenever you read the word Pidiyah, you should remember that we are only referring to Meiser Sheni, that we'll learn about later. Meiser Sheni is not Meiser Rishon. This is about Meiser Rishon, which again should be gifted to the Levi. Now, uminayin shemaiser Rishon chulen. How do you know that? Maybe indeed it is holy, because since it says the nechshav lochem, that it will be considered for you trumaschem, this truma meaning the Meiser Rishon that's given to the Levi. Kadoged min hagoyren, just like grain from your grain heap. Uvechameleyon, just like your fullness of the vat. Meaning, what is the Torah trying to tell you? That magoyren the yakif, just like grain heap and a vat. Chulin l'chol davar, this is chulin food. Af Meiser Rishon shenitla trumasei, obviously, because we will learn in a moment that after the Levi receives the Meiser Rishon, he's not good to go. The Levi then is obligated to separate 10% from his 10%. And that has to be gifted to the Kohen. And that has Kedusha like Truma, of course. But after he separates his Truma, Chulon l'chol davar, that's what the Torah means in Koirach, when the Torah says that your Truma, meaning the Meiser Rishon, will be mamish like Dagan min hagoyren, the Chamalea min hayakev, Lefikach Bas Levi, that if she gets kidnapped, or if she has a relation that she's not allowed to have. Now, if we are referring to Truma, as we learned, her getting kidnapped, the presumption is that one of her captors had a relation with her, invalidating her of ever eating Truma again. If she has a Be'ilas Nus with another man, then she's never allowed to eat Truma again. But by a Levi, there's no such a thing because there's no Kedusha there. If she heard that her husband died, and as we will learn, that even though normally you have to have two witnesses testifying to such an event, here they were leaning in with her because she knows that if her first husband will return, all of the consequences that she's going to have, she can be with the first husband, she can be with the second husband. So initially she's allowed to get remarried, or if there's only one witness that her husband died, and again, normally one witness is not believed, here he is, and she got remarried and her first husband came back. Here we say, the only time that there will be a consequence regarding Meiser Rishon is that she will not be allowed to eat Meiser, even though Meiser indeed has no Kedusha. That's because she should have, before getting remarried, been more certain that her first husband passed away. Obviously, her first husband returned. So that's an additional knas, in addition to what we will learn in Ilchas Geirush and Perek Yud. Halacha Gimel. Leviim v'Kohanim, both Leviim and Kohanim, also are obligated to separate Meiser Rishon. You can ask the question, why does a Levi have to separate Meiser Rishon? Anyways, it's going to him. And as we will see, Chavra, a Kohen is a valid recipient for Meiser Rishon. So why does the Kohen have to separate Meiser Rishon? Anyways, it's going to go to him. And the answer is because they are obligated to separate from the Meiser Rishon Trumas Meiser, which they have to do. And by the way, a Kohen who gets Truma, if the Kohen grew produce, he also has to separate Truma, even though he ends up giving the Truma to himself. So what you Taka would have thought, a Kohen gets to eat Truma, a Kohen can be the recipient of Meiser Rishon. The Kohen then is the recipient of Trumas Meiser. So maybe he shouldn't have to separate anything. No, Talmud Leimer, that's why the Torah says, Kein Torimu Gam Atem. So shall you separate, and the Torah says, then the words also you, what's the also you? The Piyashmo Lamdu Atem. You, Leviim, also you, Kohanim. Even though, again, they're separating it and they're, so to say, they are allowed to give it to themselves, but that act of separation must always happen. You don't take Meiser from the Kohen, like we just mentioned, that the Kohanim are valid recipients of Meiser Rishon, even though we always say it goes to the Levi. Guys, don't forget that Kohanim do come from the tribe of Levi. As it says, only when it comes from a Yid, from a Yisrael, then it should be going to a Levi. But if it's coming from a Kohen, the Kohen can keep it. Any other gift of a Kohen doesn't have to give it to another Kohen. He gets to keep it. And furthermore, the Rambam wants us to remember that historically, that when Ezra went up during the initial time of Bayis Sheni, and he finalized the building of the second temple, and he attempted to bring with him many Yidden that lived in Bavel, and not everyone went. The Torah writes a very low number of Jews went. And the worst of all is that when it came to the Levium, there were so few Levium that they weren't even a distinct group of significant numbers. Basically, no Levium went with him. So Ezra penalized the Levium at that time, that no one should give to the Levium the Meiser Rishon. Imagine, during the beginning of the times of Bayis Sheni, Meiser Rishon was only given to Kohanim. All of this is just emphasizing that even beyond the time of the Knas, Kohanim could be the recipients of Meiser Rishon, and therefore when they separate, if they grow produce, they have to separate it, but they get to keep it themselves. Halacha hey. Ha'oichel peiros tvalim. God forbid if a person eats produce prior to any of these separations, or if a Levi eats Meiser betivloi, meaning prior to separating Trumas Meiser. Now here you should know, even though the Chayev Misa b'dei Shamayim, God forbid, nevertheless, they don't have to make financial compensation. In other words, as it says, that they have to separate it for God, meaning that it doesn't belong to any specific Kohen or Levi, only until it was separated. If it wasn't separated, so the person who ate it is eating tevel, misa b'dei shamayim, but it doesn't have to make financial restitution. Listen to this. Being that Trumas or Meisers To begin with, is only midrabanan. So there's a huge leniency, which is that a person can start eating tevel, means produce that was not tithed at all. Obviously, midrabanan, you have to tithe it. But that person can say, I will tithe it later. I know that I have, let's say, 100 apples here. He can start eating them with the knowledge that eventually he's going to have to give 2 apples as truma. He's going to have to give from the remaining 98, even though there's no 98, since there was 98, 9.8 apples as meiser rishon, etc., etc. But you can separate trumas from meisers later. Halachavav yakir pei dekrishin hilchas meiser halachavav ma'asrin min makam makam acher. You don't have to have all of the produce gathered together. You can give produce from one location also for the other location. Have to be ma'asrit min hamukav, guys. Mukav means that the produce has to be grouped together. We learned by truma that lechatchila truma has to be separated min hamukav. We don't have such a thing when it comes to mice. Avo, but yes, like truma, ein ma'asrin min al she'enim. You know that you cannot separate from one species on the other. Apples for apples, orange for oranges. You understand? Wheat for wheat, barley for barley. As we'll learn so many details later, when you're chayiv, when you're pater, and even if you did so post facto, and actually, other than the din of min hamukov, that meisres could be given shaloi min hamukov, halacha zayin, that Rambam gives now some simple rules which are very helpful, and the opportunity to review. That Rambam is not going to review hilchas truma, but there will be a general, very a beautiful correlation, which is like this. Whenever we learn in truma, that you can't separate from one type on the other, or whatever the issue is. That post facto truma, same thing will be by meiser and mitrash, meiser of meisers. Will automatically be exempt from a meiser. Furthermore, we're speaking now individuals that may separate. Pashit, like goyim cannot separate, and we learned all these dinim in hilchas truma. Whoever can separate truma can separate meiser. V'chol shobarnu behem, that they cannot separate truma, but at least b'diavad v'im tarmu trumasam truma, and kachim is truma asrei say meisers. V'chol she'ein trumasi truma, even b'diavad kach ein masreis of meisers. Halacha ches. Guys, listen to this. This is an amazing concept, a psychological concept. I will tithe on your behalf. Guys, the shliach Yakir offered, he was not asked. He offered, I will do something for you. That's the way it works. If I offer on my own to do something from you, you can rely that I did it. You don't even have to follow up. If you ask me to do something for you, then you have to follow up. Guys, don't forget that if I don't separate meiser, you understand it's tevel. There's trumas meiser, chayv misa b'dei shamayim. So here, if a person offers on their own, then the owner doesn't have to witness it happening, or if he didn't do it, or furthermore, it's all included, the owner doesn't even have to ask the shliach, did you do it? No, since someone offered it on their own, they're going to do it. Chazaka. But if Reuven asked Shimon, do me a favor. Asad al Yadi, separated from me. He asked to la'amadimai. La'amadimai literally means he has to stand there. It doesn't mean he has to stand there. He has to either stand there or he has to follow up. Now let's go. Hecharuvim, Karab, Eina, Chayavim, B'maisris, Elam Devreim. They're only obligated to be tithed by rabbinic law. Why? So now we're starting to learn some basic rules because most people don't eat carobs. Who eats carobs that I know? We, Fruma people, unlike Bo'emer, we are obsessed with carobs. That's because of the Rashbi. But otherwise, it's not edible. Bitter almonds, as we know, we learn a lot in Hasidus about it. They're sweet almonds, they're bitter almonds. Here, Bein Bekotten, Bein Begodlun, they are completely exempt, not even Midrabanan, because they are not considered food. And by the way, they're considered poison. Another thing, if you have a tree planted in your home, because it says in the Aser to Aser, Ace called Fuas, it says the ones that grow in your field. That excludes stuff that grows in your house. However, says that Rambam V'yirali, I think that you're right. You are exempt midoiraisa, but you are chayv b'maisos midrabim. You're chayv midrabban. What's the Rambam's proof? Because we know from the dinim, as we're going to learn in Perek Dal, we're going to learn tomorrow. Fruit of a fig tree that's standing not in the field. By the way, your chutzner and your house is the same thing. It's not out there in the field. So we're going to learn later that fruits that are mamish picked one by one, like figs are not ready at the same time. If they're picked one by one, they will never be obligated to be tithe. But nevertheless, we learned that if you pick them together, right? If you did pick them together, you are going to be chayiv. But hold on, that no one debates that. That's a Mishnah. If the Rambam says, you're going to tell me, not grow out in the field, it won't even be chayiv midrabanan, then this whole halacha doesn't make sense. Who cares if you pick the figs together? They're growing in your chutzner. They're not growing in your field. Haraya that you are chayiv midrabanan. Halacha Yud Aleph. Guys, we're going to learn a lot of, we'll become farmers. Pirkei Avos says, hafach ba, the hafach ba, the chayla ba. Everything is in the Torah. Halacha Yud Aleph. B'tzalim shishrishu zeh b'tzad zeh. Onions take root one near the other. Even if they take root in bekarka aliyah, if you put out some earth on your roof, and they took root there, paturin min hamaisis, they are exempt from maisis because the person does not desire to have these types of plants grow over there. And that's going to be a very big rule. And furthermore, let me just go back to what the Rambam says. Number one, Yakir. Number one, if it doesn't grow in the field, you're potted midoraisa. That's number one. But the Rambam just paskined that what? That midrabanan you're chayiv. Now he's adding, when are you chayiv midrabanan if you want it to be there? Something that you don't want to be there, like you put out your onions, you didn't put it for it to take root there. And onions, we know this from the kids, they come back. It takes root sometimes. If you don't want it, you're not even chayiv midrabanan. But that's because it's in your home. But if the house had a landslide, if the house got a bit fall in, and now they are exposed. In other words, now they're not on your aliyah. Now they're out. So it's as if they're planted in the field and the chayiv and maisis. Your house became a sadeh, not even a chatzir. Halacha Yud Beis. Now here we go, another thing, guys. Produce that's hefker is exempt to be tithe, period. How do you know when something is hefker? Well, obviously, if the owner says, I'm mafker it, it's hefker. But as we figure out, we extrapolate from this halachim, when you no longer have a guard guarding your field, that is a proof that you don't care if anyone is going to go and take, because whatever is there for you is already insignificant, which means it's hefker. Now, different items are ready at different times. So when a person has, let's say, figs, after all of the figs were harvested, if you have in that area a vineyard, grapes are ready even later in the season. So that's the case in Yud Beis. If a person still has a shomer, but he only has a shomer because he has another, he has grapes, he has vines there, he wouldn't have put the shomer only because of the ta'enim. But there is some leftover ta'enim. But someone did get one of those figs. Or another example, when it comes to vegetables, zucchinis and squash are also only ripe at the end of the season. You still have a guard guarding your McChoys, which is zucchini, yamadlois, and squash. But at that time, the grapes were already harvested. Now, you had some singular grapes that you didn't care about. You wouldn't have put a guard for it, but the guard was there anyway. And someone went and picked the leftover little grapes. So is it hefker or not? The Rambam says it depends. Every case is a case. If the owners were makbid, if he got upset, he says, hold on, I still had a guard there. Why did you go take it? Then whoever took it is considered a gazlan, which means it's not hefker. Ubemela they're chayv b'maisis ubatruma. Ein balabais makbid aleim. Mutarim mishum gazal b'turim and amaiser. Goes hand in hand together. That's a very simple rule. It's just having a shomer is not enough, because it could be you have a shomer for another product. Halacha Yud Gimel. You have to give the most choice of the produce for maiseres. And maiseres means for trumas and maiseres. And that's the pshat in the pasuk in Parshas Koyach. That baharimchem es chelboy mimenu. When you separate, chelboy means fats. I know it means fats, but it doesn't mean fats. It means the best, the fattest, the choicest. Baharimchem es chelboy mimenu. Then benachshav laleviyim ketfuas koyden uchetfuas yaakov. Now says the Rambam, even though this pasuk is referring to ma'aser rishon, but the rule is kshem shemaiser shemafrishim alavim has to be min achelav shaboy. What's there, trumas meiser has to be from the choicest. Kach meiser that the yidden separate min agodim and min hayakav has to be min achela from the choicest portion. Halacha yudalid ein maaserin bo'omet. You may not separate meisers by estimation. Mamish the opposite of truma. So basically, we have two things. That truma lechatchila has to be min amukov, and meiser does not have to be min amukov. Truma is by estimation around 2%. 10% has to be bidiyuk, and if not, it's a problem. Ella, either b'mida by measuring, b'mishkal means by weighing, b'minyan by numbering. Whichever item is sold by measure has to be tithed by measure. If it's sold by weight, it has 10% of the weight. If it's sold by numbers, you have to tithe the dafka by numbers. The more you are specific, meshubach, the more you are praised. Now, why? Why not say, hold on, God told me to give 10%. Yakir, I can hear you.
It has to be specific lekan ulechan, or it could be
lekan ulechan. Oh, very good. No, it's so when people learn this, so I get it. If God said 10%, I can't give 9. I get that. But why do I care if I'll give 11? Why do I care? We do care. It's very bad to give 11. Why? Let me explain to you why. Because anything beyond 10% is not considered meiser. What is it considered? Chulin. But hold on. When do we say that the chulin that remains after the meiser is tithed if they're separated? If the chulin is mixed with the meiser, it's not considered separated. So that's like the worst thing. That's tevel. The Rambam writes it. That we say b'chol hamad b'maisers, even if you give more, it ruins everything. It ruins the meisers because tevel mo'edav b'hem. Now the other produce is good, Yakir. The remaining produce is good because you separated 10%. The problem is only the 11% that's still mixed with the meiser. It doesn't have a din of meiser. It's not called meiser. That's the pshat. Because it's more than what God wanted. But it's not mesukin because it's mixed in. Halacha tezvav. Wow, these are the basic rules. Hamafresh mixes meiser. Now what happens if a guy only separated 5%? He's for whatever reason. We don't say, oh, that's good. 5% and he still owes 5%. It does not work that way. Eino meiser. Eino meiser. You know what we say he did, Yakir? Look at this. If I have produce here, and if I separated a little amount, we consider the bigger amount tevel and the smaller amount tevel. Now that you separate the meiser, you have to separate 10% from the big and 10% from that 5%. We just learned in this pedic that meiser doesn't have to be min hamukaf. You don't have to put it together. Here you have to put it together. If you separated it wrong, now each heap has to be tied by itself. That's halacha tezvav. In other words, you have to separate from that little pile. The Rambam is going to give numbers. For example, a person had 100 sa'ah, which means you have to give 10 sa'ah meiser. And this chacham, for whatever reason, now separated only 5. First of all, that 5 is not meiser. Number two, now he has 95 and 5. Each pile has to have from it its own 10% separated. Now, bin hamukav normally is good. Here we don't allow you to do it that way. Like a knas, you separate it wrong, every pile has to have its own tithing. Now, what's 10% from 5? A half a saw. The final halach of this chapter, halach tes zayin hamatrish meiser. This goes back to generally, it doesn't go back to the halacha tezvav. Whenever you separate this meiser, meaning meiser rishon, the topic of this series, you have to make a bracha kederach shel mevarchim al kol hamitzvos. Chein mevarach al meiser sheni. as we'll learn later. And when it is in the 3rd year and on the 6th year, Meiser Ani. And when the Levi separates from his Meiser, Meiser Mina Meiser. Mevarech al kol echad b'fnei atzmai. However, if a person separated everything together, Truma and Meiser Ish and Meiser Sheni or Meiser Ani, and he doesn't speak in between these separate separations, then Koilel and Bracha Achas. And what will be the nusach? Beautiful. Okay. Now I know that we don't have that much Gemara on Zroim. We have Talmud Yerushalmi. God willing, we'll learn that together. But one of the areas in which people get very much confused when it comes to Maisres is that people confuse 2 things. These are the words, and God willing, it should be. If we come out with this clear today, Chevra, when you're going to learn Mishnayos, you're going to understand. You're going to already never get confused. There are 2 dinim by Maisres. Don't confuse them. Here are the words. One is called Oinas HaMaisres. Oina means the time of, or the phase of tithing. So the product has to reach the phase of tithing. Prior to reaching that level of maturity, of being ready, you are b'chlal not chayv to tithe it. That's number 1. That will be Perek Sheni. Perek Shlishi that we're learning today, we're learning 3 chapters a day. Or for people who are learning Perek Echad, tomorrow Perek Shlishi will be about Gemar Malach. Gemar Malach means even after something reached Oinas HaMaisres, you cannot eat it achilas keva, but you can have it achilas aray. You can snack off it. But once it comes to Gemar Malacha, as we'll explain in the next chapter, then you achilas aray. Or you can't even give it to your animals, which is like eating it achilas aray. And that disentangles, and that's a light that the Rambam gives to this whole topic of tithing. So this chapter is about Oinas HaMaisres, and this chapter, like the Iker, and a little bit next chapter, again, it's going to be allowed, the Rambam is going to go through all of the different products. It's going to be mamish farming. And the Rambam is going to describe to you what is the level of maturity, of ripeness, that the Torah says, now it hit Oinas HaMaisres. This chapter has 8 halachas, beginning with halacha Aleph. Ein chayav lahafresh meiser min haTorah elo, for a couple of big rules. I gave a good intro to the Pedic, but here the Rambam is adding other big rules. You're only obligated to separate Meiser. Number 1, Hagoymer Peroisev. Like we said, Hagoymer Peroisev is really mainly the topic of next chapter. That means that you completed all of the work that's associated with this. Like certain vegetables, you work until when it's in the basket and you cover the basket. Now it's ready to go to the market. You have to finish all the work. But the ikar is that you finished it to eat it yourself. People are shocked when they hear this the first time. If a person grew product and they went through all of the steps and it's fully harvested and they finished the malach, but they're planning to sell it, which is what many people do. If you grew it to sell it, the Rambam says you are patur min haTorah. You are chayiv midivreya. Midrabanan, you have to tithe it. But lechatchila, it's only a drabanan.
But at the beginning of halacha, where Hagomer Perois le'achlam le'atzmo, where? In his house or is on his field?
Doesn't matter where, but he's doing it for him. That's the point. He's growing it for him. There's many steps about the house. We'll get to that. Don't worry, Yakin. Everything between the 2nd and the 3rd chapter, people that are familiar and they had questions when they learned it, and it has to the Iyas Pnei Habayis and Gemar Malacha and Oinas HaMaisres. The Rambam is so mesudar. You'll see everything will become crystal clear. So one second. First of all, rule number 1: it's only if you're going to eat it. It's for you. And what's the source? Shneimar pasuk in the A. Aser to aser ve'ochal to. Meaning, eino chayv ela hagomer tvuas elach. Halacha 2. Now more than that, if a person he purchased product, he doesn't have to tithe it. Why? Because he did not grow it. The produce of your crops. But here also, now, in other words, bottom line is, right, we follow rabbinic law, of course. But it's important to know what's the Erais and what's the Rabbanon. Sagt der Rambam, that the one who purchased is only Chayv mid Rabbanon. When he purchased it, only that it reached the level of Gemar Malacha, as we will learn in the next chapter, while it was still in the possession of the seller. But if it only reached the point where you mamish Chayv to tithe it, once it was already in the hands of the purchaser, here, even midoraisa, he does have to tithe it. Okay, so once we got that established, and again, Gemar Malacha, in our intro, there are two steps. Oinas hamaisres, then Gemar Malacha. Now the Rambam begins. It says that Rambam Peirush she'enim ru'oyos la'achila b'katan. Be a produce that you can't eat because too small. Too small means it's not mature, it's not ripe. For example, haboisid. The word boisid means unripened produce. V'chayoytze b'hem einam chayovim b'maisres. They're not obligated to be tithed, not midoraisa, not midorabanan, achi yagdilu, until they become larger and they become halachically food. And that's the meaning in the pasuk of Bichukoisai Shenemar, Mizera ha'oretz mipri ha'etz, from the crops of the earth, from the fruit of the trees, which means it has to be called a pri. It has to be called, the chiv is only when they grow into a fruit. Same thing is with grain. The same thing is with legumes. Shenemar, as it says, asik to asik eis, called tfuah zarecha. There's no obligation until when it becomes halachically called now it's produce. That's the meaning of this phrase. You only chayiv when it reaches oinas. The word oinas in plural, oina means the time of. Here it means the phase of tithing. Whether it's fruit, whether it's produce, mutter le'echel mehen, you can eat from it any amount, any way. In other words, the whole topic of achilas arai and achilas keva that we'll have in the next chapter, that is concerning Gemar Malacha. Here we're going a step earlier, prior to the topic of Gemar Malacha. Did it bechlal reach Oinas HaMaisres? If it didn't reach Oinas HaMaisres, you can knock yourself out. Now, is it healthy to eat unripe? I don't think so. But we're speaking halachically, you can have a meal. Allah here that Rambam goes into, we're going to go through all the pros. For example, kishoy means zucchini, and now whoever Yakira understands the Hebrew, if I'm making a mistake in my translation, please correct me. The hamalafa funlis, cucumbers. These are products, I'm sorry, that they could be eaten when they're little. Why do people pluck it out of the ground later? Because they want them to be bigger. See, wanting something to be bigger doesn't mean it's unripe. It just means you want more of it. They're ready even when they're little. You know, these little pickles, you can add them when the cucumbers when they're little. Then they are chayavim b'maiser b'katan. Because as soon as they emerge, they do hit oinas hamayis. In other words, when the time of you harvesting it has nothing to do with this phase of tithing. It has to do with ripe or unripe. If it's ripe, if it's edible when it's little, it is chayiv as oinas hamayis. And again, I just want to repeat one final time in this chapter. Even after oinas hamayis, you have to have the next step of gemar malacha, which means after oinas hamayis, before gemar malacha, you can't have achilas keva, but you could have achilas arei. We'll learn this in the next chapter. You know, 2 steps. That's the key here. Halacha. Now, what's the oinas hamayis? Another sign. When the produce reaches a stage that if it has a seed in it, the seed is mature enough that if you were to harvest it now and you were to plant the seed would give off another generation. That's a gavaldik way of knowing whether it's considered oinas hamayis. And therefore every product is different. For example, hata'enim figs. When is the fig big enough that if you would now harvest it, you can plant it and it's going to regrow? When it's soft enough, in order for it to be edible after 24 hours from when you gathered it. When it comes to figs, they're not edible when you harvest it. And by the way, that means that when people harvest figs for the first 24 hours, they don't have to tithe it. They can eat it. It's not oinas hamayis. Ho'anov and grapes. Habu'ushim. Was is Ba'ushim? So the Rambam says, thin, wild grapes. When are they considered? When do they hit oinas hamaisles? When you can see the seed when you look from the outside. The Rebbe spoke many times that in nature everything has a klipa, because beruchnius we're living in the world of klipa. Then we learn in Chassidus this klipas noiga. What's klipas noiga? Begashmius, the grape. The grape is the only fruit that Hashem made that you can see through the klipa. And you can see all the way to the core. You can see the seed. How great is that? If you can see the seed, it's already mature enough. Harimonim, pomegranates. Mishayimas haperet shalahem beinoats boys. From when the seed in it can be easily crushed in order for it to become liquidy. Hatamarim dates from when mishayis bechu kasor, when they swell like yeast. Haparsikim, peaches. From when red strands begin to appear within them. From when the fruit becomes distinct from the outer shell. Hashkenim, almonds, hamasukim that are sweet. We already learned that bitter almonds are always exempt. When the external shell becomes distinct, avol, hamarim, Paturim lo'ilam, v'shar kol bali klipas, any other product that comes in hard shells, like ho'itz te roi velim acorns, v'haloit chestnuts, v'habotnim pistachios, mishayasu klipa hatachtoina, hasamuch haloichel. From when the lower shell, the shell that's close to the fruit, from when that forms. Hazesim olives, mishayasu shemen echad mekishim amashim roim lasas kishigam. When it reaches a level of maturity where it can at least produce a ninth of what it normally will produce. It's very little, but at least it reached that level. And that's called, it grew a third. Whenever you read, mishagia l'shlish, a shlish means that it will give you a ninth of the potential oil. Hatapuchim, apples, vesregim, esrigs, mishayisaglu, from when they become round, which is much earlier on, because indeed they are edible when they're smaller. People leave them on the tree, like we said before, for them to become bigger, for you to have more apple. Ha'oig, I have no idea what oig is. Batusim and berries, mishiadim, for when it becomes red. Any product that by naturally becomes red, it's considered oinis hamaisris, mishiadim, when it turns red, when it has red streaks, when it starts to turn red. Hecharuvim, carib, even though we said carobs is only midrabanan, okay, but midrabanan. When some black spots begin to appear, anything that naturally becomes black, when is it? From when it starts to get some black spots. Okay. Ho'agosim, pears. V'hakerus temelim, small pears. V'aperishim, and quince. V'uzrarim, and thorn apples. So far, Yakir did not correct once. Mishiyasu karachis levanois, from when here they have this little fuzzy here. When the hair begins to fall off, it becomes bald. That's a sign of maturity. How, like by people, right? Anything that is going to become light colored. When is it considered when it at least starts to get some white colored patches? Patches. Let's go now to produce. Mishatavi shlish, when it's grown a third. Hatilsan chilba mishayia zara ru'uya letzmicha. In Nisra, like we mentioned before, if it reached the level of maturity that if you were to harvest it now and replant it, it will grow. Ubayarik, when it comes to vegetables, so haki shoyim zucchini, v'hadulim, and squash, v'avatichem, and watermelons, v'amalafonois, and cucumbers, v'chei v'chol kayotze b'hen. Like we mentioned, the chayv, even when they're little, because there are ru'uim lachila. The shara yarok, it depends. The other vegetables that are not edible until when they become bigger. Okay, so then everyone, the Rambam doesn't go into details. You have to know everyone in a chayv achi yaroi lachil. Now, eshkoil, if you have a cluster. Now, not all the grapes are maturing at the same time exactly. So the rule is, if even only one grape on the cluster reach the level of maturity, all of that cluster is considered oinas hamaislis. And not only that cluster, but the entire side of the vine. Wow. It's considered oinas hamaislis. And the same concept goes by a pomegranate. If you have a pomegranate tree and you have only one pomegranate that reached the level that we learned before, that you can crush a seed in it and it turns into liquid easily. So even if only one of them reached that level, the entire side of that tree is called Higil Oinas Amaistis. Once it reached this phase, you're not allowed to sell it to a person that's not Neman al Hamaistis, right? That's called Lifnei Ivalisit and Michel. The in Bikru, and if a portion of the produce ripened, like we mentioned, so that side of the vine, that side of the pomegranate tree, okay, so then remove that side. Because it's only a side of the tree, the other side didn't reach the level yet. A person should not sell his olive dregs, nor the ezug of his grape dregs to a person that's not neman to separate maistas. And they're buying it in order to get liquid out of it, because the rule is that the liquids that will come out of those dregs, at least in many times, will be chayv and mais. Similarly, a person many times has straw, but in the straw you have grain kernels. You understand? So if a person is selling straw, and the reason why the guy is buying it is because they're going to be taken out the little grains, you cannot sell it because those grains that you will remove from the straw will be chayv and meiser. Halacha zayin shimrei yayin, when a person is mixing water with wine dregs, right, and you're filtering it. So here's the rule. If you put in, let's say, 3 liters of water, and you're going to end up with 4 liters. In other words, what came out from the Shimrei Hayayin, a fourth of the total. That's a lot. It's considered wine, not water. And now, you have to separate the tithing. I Pasha don't know why must it be mimakam acher. That I don't get. Maybe because he's speaking about Trumas and Maises. Minamukov, I don't know. And I think there might be some who don't even have this in the gear here. But anyways, the point is, I'm taking it back. Only Maises. of Truma. Because when you took off Truma, don't forget, Truma is not exact. Truma midoraisa is 1 drop for no matter how much. With the Rabbanan, it's 2%. But when you took it off lechatchila, even though the Rabbanan are around 2%, you took it for everything that will come out of these grapes. Like we learned in Ilchos. It's only Maisa that has to be b'diuk. But all of that is only because we consider the whatever came out at the end to be yayin and not temed, wine and not water. But if you put in, let's say, 3 liters of water, and yes, some juices came out of the dregs of the grapes, but you don't have 4 liters. It's and even though it tastes to you like wine, that is butter. It's not called wine at all. It's called water. Water does not need to be tithed. And the final halach of this chapter, halachiches, hamagdish peiroisov, when they are still attached to the ground, prior to them reaching this oinas hamaisis. And as we will be learning, that when produce is biyad hegdish bisman, the chiyuv is chal, it's going to be exempted from being tithed, even if you bought it out, you redeemed it from hegdish later. But over here in halacha ches, it did not reach oinas hamaistis while it belonged to hegdish. It was redeemed prior to oinas hamaistis. It's going to be chayv and meiser. It belonged in the past to hegdish. I don't care. But that's the key. Only then do we say, now that the chalois chiyuv came about, it's biyad hegdish. Hegdish doesn't have to be tithed. Once it doesn't have to be tithed, even if you redeemed it later, the chiyuv won't be chal later. They will always remain exempt. And now, Chevra, we are starting today's final chapter, the 3rd chapter. So after we establish the big rule that we learned in Perek Sheni, that koidem shehigilu oinas hamaistres, you're not chayiv at all, which means you can even eat achilas kevach. Now the 3rd chapter will introduce the next step, the final step. And just to repeat it, even though we said it in the last chapter, just to review, that even after something reaches Oinas HaMaisres, there is still another phase called Gemar Malacha. Now, Oinas HaMaisres, prior to Gemar Malacha, is not Pater V'Lo Klum. You can't have Achilas Keva, but you can have Achilas Aray. Once it reaches Gemar Malacha, you cannot even eat Achilas Aray. Beautiful. This chapter has 25 halachas, beginning with halacha. Once produce reached the Oinas HaMaisres, the phase of tithing that we learned in the previous chapter, and another detail, and it's detached, because something can reach Oinas HaMaisres and it's still attached, right? But now that you detached it, but the work that is done to prepare it, to take it home, to sell it, was not yet finished. As an example, if you have produce, right, the 5 grains that you already harvested it. First of all, it shlish, we learned in the previous chapter. So it reached the level of maturity. If you were to reseed it, it's going to grow. And you not only did you harvest it, but you already threshed it. Doesn't matter. If you did not yet winnow it, or even if you already winnowed it, but you didn't smooth the pile, that's called meircha, meiruach. The smoothing of the pile is the last thing that's done in the field. The din is that since it's not gemar malachton, mutar le'echol mehem achilas aray, you can have a snack that Rambam will define in this chapter. What's the definition of aray? But a temporary meal can be eaten. But that's only achet gemar malachton, until when all of the work preparing it is completed. Or misha the gemar malachton, then you can't even have achilas aray. Halacha base. That it's about the meiruach. That's only big goyim perois of l'machar mashuk. If you are, the goal is to finish its work, to sell it in the market. Stam lohoir, that in Perek Sheni we learned that anything that you are growing to sell, don't forget that, is only mechuyev midrabanan. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Really, the Rambam already passed it that you only chayiv midaraisa when you grow it and you took it in to eat. Even if you did the meiruach, even after Gemar Malacha, you can eat it. Okay, so then what will be the cutoff point where Yakir, you can't even eat aray? Another word, sheyakavu l'maiser. Kol l'maiser means that now the obligation of tithing was established. Gewaldig. Oinas hamaisnes, Gemar Malacha, sheyakavu, shehukvu l'maiser, sheyakavu l'maiser. The Rambam is saying gewaldig. Sometimes you learn Mishnah. We learned this when we learned this before the Rambam. People get confused. Like, is it Gemar Malacha or is it sheyakavu l'maiser? People say they're the same. They're not the same. Gemar Malacha, as we said, is meiruach. By tfu, it's the meiruach. But Gemar Malacha, after which you can't even have aray, is only when you're selling it. If you're bringing it home, then we use the words, it has to be affixed. Now, what a fix is? 6 things, not all 6, one of the 6. So good, so mesuder. Halacha Gimel, the echad mishisha devarim is koivei ala maisrais. They bring the ultimate obligation. Obligation means that post this, you can't even have it as aray. Number 1, bias, which means bringing it into the house. Number 2 is mekach, selling it, right? You made a transaction with it. Number 3 is eish, subjecting it to fire. As we'll see, cooking it, baking it. We'll see more details. Sometimes taka, like in Hilchos Shabbos, klei rishon, klei sheni. We're going to have all this over here. Number 4, melach is salting it. Number 5, truma, if you separated truma. And number 6, the commencement of Shabbos. Gavaldik. Shabbos is such a gavaldik day that Shabbos, now cover. Now, one thing don't forget that Rambam says, even though you're bringing it home, you can't skip the step of Gemar Malacha. The kulam ein koivin ela b'davar shenigman ha'malachtoi. Amazing. So if you're bringing it into your house, you have to have oinas hamaistus. You have to have that. Number 2, you have to have Gemar Malacha. And since you're not selling it lashuk, you're bringing it home, you also have to have sheikavu l'maiser. Now, chevra, that's it. Ashreinu, you got it. Now let's go into details. Okay, so for example, Allah Dalit, if you are planning to take this Pedus home, nevertheless, and we'll see details. Means you brought it into your house the normal manner. If a person wanted to exempt himself, he would bring it to the roof. He would bring it up through the window. Once it entered the house, now the beautiful thing is that the Rambam made it clear that's only because shenigman malachton. As we'll see soon in this chapter, if someone brought it into the house, then the iyas pnei abayis in itself will also not be enough. If it was sold, it was cooked in fire. We'll see in a clay shine. It was soaked in salt. If you separated Shabbos commenced. It's one of the six, not all of the six, or not biased with the other. Each one for itself is koveya. Now, like the Rambam said, the first one, no, it's not kovua yet. But what happens? He's once you began the Gemara Malacha. Now that you began that chayv la'asar hakol, for example, hichnes kishuyin or deloyin, you brought zucchini or squash into the house. Now, what's the Gemara Malachton? Koydem sheyefash feish, before you rub them to remove the hairs on their surface. This has nothing to do with Einas HaMaisos, but that would be the Gemara Malach. So now the rule is, even though you have a whole pile of 50 zucchinis, if you only rubbed the hair off one of them, now nikvar kol meiser, and you can't even snack until you separate the meisers. If you separated trumos, which we said is one of the six, still with one exception. Other than a basket of figs. Over there, we say that if you separated truma even before Gemar Malacha, figs are unique. Nikva ala meiser. They are going to be established for meiser. And why is that different? Because figs, we already mentioned in the last chapter, are very unique, that every fruit is separate. What really is kaveya la meiser is putting it into the basket. They were already put into the basket, so there was some sort of Gemar Malacha. So now, Riyas B'nei Abayis, Truma will be enough. Truma with the fact that they were placed in the basket. Halacha 5. Maybe if you have a fig branch, and there are figs on the branch, or machabde tomato, you're bringing in date fronds, and you have dates on them. If children brought it in, if workers brought it in other words, it's not theirs, because there isn't yet Gemar Malacha. Now, guys, we're going to learn soon that once there is Gemar Malacha, I don't care who brought it in. But here we're speaking about, it wasn't even Gemar Malacha. But yes, chayovim b'mais. Next, if you brought in stalks of grain, and you plant in the house to take the kernels off and to crush it and to winnow it, still it came in stalks, because it's not Gemar Malacha, because you plan to turn it into flour. But if you brought in these stalks because you want to eat them as kernels, that was your snack. Now, yes, the fact that you brought it into the house, this concept is only by grains, any one of the 5 grains: wheat, barley, oats, rye, and oats, rye, and spelt. Legumes, because kernels of legumes are generally not connected to be eaten at this stage. So we say, as we'll learn later, a person can, go make a legal loophole, can look to make a legal loophole, and to bring them inside their shaft. We mentioned before that eating arai, we're going to have soon, and giving it to your animal is considered the same. So if you want to be able to give it to your animal prior to tithing it, so you can make a haram, and then, guys, if you want to eat it, so then you have to do it slowly. You have to winnow it slowly, And then if that will be the case, since it was never nigmar malachton, you will always be exempted at tumas and ma'ases. Shaharei einoi maschal ligman hakoil. Wow. Okay. However, let's go back to halacha zayin. If you made gemar malacha, but you did it for someone else without their consent, so the rule is it will make it tevel. Wow. In other words, that big difference between halacha zayin that people get confused and halacha hey. By halacha hey, the items were not, there was no gemar malacha, and since there was no gemar malacha, they brought it into the house. Here, the fact is that's if you made it, if you completed it, that will be effective. Halacha ches. Let's go again, like we had in the previous chapter.
Katan, not by a chaver. It's by a katan, by a worker. Behei
Doesn't make a difference. Even if a worker were to do the gemar haperes, it will make it into tevel.
Design. Good. You ask good. So if a worker design, right, could have done, then he could have done this.
Yes. Because here we're speaking about gemar malacha. There's gemar malacha, and then there is the kriyas l'maisos. Don't confuse them. Halacha 8. Let's go. What's the gemar malacha of Pedus? This is similar to what we had in the previous chapter. So like this. Once you start rubbing them in your hands, and you remove these like little gilded white hedalach, the fuzz. But if you didn't rub it, there's another thing that can make it gemar malacha, which is when you make them into a pile. Similarly, uba avatich by watermelon, you don't make a watermelon into a pile. What do you do when you organize them? When you arrange them in a designated place, putting one next to the other. But they couldn't pile watermelons because they're like rounded, they're going to collapse. But that's considered a pile. So the rule is, Kivin Shagamar called Sarchay, Nigman Malach. Another din, interestingly, because when it comes to zucchini, when it comes to squash, some people don't remove the gilded here. So in other words, some things are subject to what the owner plans to do. That's the end of halacha ches. Halacha tes, if this type of vegetable is normally bundled up, that will be the gemar malacha. Gemar malacha when it was bundled. If you never bundled this type, so then what's the gemar malacha when you fill up a keli? If you don't fill up a keli, so then it's going to be how much did you gather? Halacha yud kalkala a basket. When the owners would fill up the basket, they would normally cover it with leaves or with straw. Then it's called gemar malacha. And if the owners are not planning to cover it, so it's when it gets full. No, many gemar malachas have to do with the das of the way of the balabais gathers his stuff. Same thing. It's called sarchay. Halacha yud aleph kli gadol. If you have a very large utensil, but your intent is only to fill up half. We don't say it has to be fully full. No, that's your lachatchila, your kavanah. Kivin shemila chetzir, which was your intent. Now the obligation takes effect. Hoy badati lamali says kulay, then enenit valachimal is kulay. The more than that says that if you have two baskets, you have two containers, and your intent is to fill up two containers, so then alo yitablu achimal shneim. Halacha yid base ogad hayerik eged gadol basadet. You made a very large bundle in the field, even though you plan when you take it home or when you're going to take it to the market to break it down into smaller bundles. Now, the fact that you made it into a bundle in the field, nitbol, weiter, ha-pered. Was is das pered? Pered are dry pomegranate seeds. Hatzimukam and raisins, v'acharuvim and carobs, mishiyama darim b'reish gagoy, when you pile them on top of your roof. That's when it's called gemar malacha. Habitzolim, onions, nishiyosed ha'olam, when you remove the leaves, v'haklipas, and that brown klipa, shadarkum lashlicham aleim, the ones that you throw by themselves. Now, if you don't plan to throw them out, like today, we buy them in the market with them. If you don't plan to throw them out, so then again, nishiyama darim, when you make them into a pile. Halacha yud gimel, hatfu a grain, We mentioned always miruach. That's the miruach is only by grain. Misheyemoreach, when you smooth it out. What exactly is it? When you beautify, when you the outer part of the pile, barachas, using the pitchfork, whatever they use. Besides kol davar. At the end of everything. They're not adding anything else anymore. Which is what you do when you finish with this pile. Now, this farmer never smooths it out with his pitchfork. So here again, it's very consistent. Whenever he says this pile, I'm done with this pile. This pile is considered for him completed. When it comes to legumes, when you sift them. Now, the noitel metachas, it's not just sifting them, but then you remove from under this. Once you removed it from under the sifter, that's it. If you're not even sifting them, so then until you make the miruach. An exception, muta little minha kutoyim. Even after you made the smoothing, sometimes you have those legumes that were scattered, or they are on the sides in the straw. That is something that you can take. That's not included in the miruach. Halacha yudalet. Now, if you have pictures, it's going to be helpful. The point will be like this. Number one, when it comes to wine, when wine was taken to a press, so they would put the grapes in what we call the gas el yoina. It would go through a tzinoid into the boil, and then they would remove it from the boil and put it into a barrel. That's Gemar Malacha, the barrel. Hayayin Nishani Chabachavi is only when it's in the barrel, and not that in itself is not enough. The Yishla Hazugin and the peels and the chartzanin and the seeds are skimmed off the top of the barrel, which means that when the wine is still in the vat, even when you lifted it up to put it in the barrel, it's not called Gemar Malach, and therefore you can have Arai. The koilet min agas wal yonim min atzinor min amakum shusayser. In other words, you can take some wine out of the gas wal yonim, you can take it out of the tzinoor. It's not yet called Gemar Malacha, and therefore achilas arai will be permitted. Halacha tezvav. Similarly, when it comes to a olive press, so here also, when does it become completed? Only when it descends into the uka, which is the vat. You have to see a picture to appreciate it. And furthermore, even though it's going down, even though while some of it is going down, you can still remove some oil from the ekel, from the rope basket, or minham nemel, from the stone mill, from the boards, and you can put it either into a small dish or into a tamchoy, into a large palotech. Now, by the way, even though it's hot, as long as it's not a kledishon, because it's not called eish that we learned about before, then because then it's mispashel, and the cooking it will establish its obligation as we learned. Now, really, we have to clarify that because we also mentioned that this whole concept of kivios is only after Gemar Malacha. If it's by the olives, by the oil, we say no. Halacha tes zayin ha'igel shel devela cake, a cake of dried figs. What's called Gemar Malacha, Misha Yachli Keno, from when it's smooth. Hagroigerois dried figs, it's from Misha Yodesh when it's crushed. And if it's put into a storage container, from when you will smooth out the surface of the container by hand. If you are threshing it, if you're crushing it into a barrel, you're crushing things into a jug or and the Nishbrach is Hamagura. Since it was already in there, even though now it broke out of it, you're already chayiv. Figs and grapes that were set aside to dry. If it was set aside to dry, it's not called finished yet until when it's dried, right? When it's on the roof drying or wherever, you can eat it there, no problem. Arai. But if you remove to take it to another place, even though whatever you removed is not yet fully dried. Until you put it out on the roof to dry.
How are we learning Gemilas Melacha if all we do is transforming them from one location to another?
No, because I'll answer, because once you put them on the roof to dry, you can argue that's the Gemar Malach. You're, in other words, it's going to dry by itself. Even though it's not dry. If it's there, the moment you removed it, then we say you put it on the roof already. That's the way I understand. Okay, right. Charuv and Karib actually prior to putting it out on the roof to dry, you can take it out to give it to animals. Because Karib, unlike the figs and the grapes, whatever you remove is removed. By Karibs, even when you remove some, you would put it back later. That's the big rule. In other words, even though that you're not chayiv to separate anything until the meruach, if the person separated truma while it was still in the stalks, now we say, you separated truma. You can't even have arai before you take off the. I'm sorry. If you took off ma'aser rishon, you went out of the seder. You have to separate truma. And by the way, here we also learned that since you took it off bashibalim, you only have to separate trumas ma'aser, and you don't have to also separate the amount that you would have given to the kohen had you done it al pi haseder. We'll leave that to explain another time. And if you ate it, finally. So arai, what's called arai in America? Arai who? What's called the snack? So here the Rambam says, if a person is peeling barley kernels and eating it, snack is not about the amount that you eat, it's about how you are eating it. If you peel one at a time, in your mouth, that's called arai, even if you ate a ton. But if first you peeled a few, because you don't want to pop in your mouth one at a time, you want to put more at a time, then you're chayv to be ma'aser. Amazing. Similarly, so there the rule is, you sift the shaft from one hand to the other. But the moment you sifted it and then you threw it into your lap, the moment you're gathering them, you're chayiv. If you sifted them in a keli, in a utensil, so it's not about the quantity, but it's the manner in how you are eating. That's a big klal. If you take some of the wine and you put it inside a ka'ara, as long as it's cold, you can't put it in a kedera, which is on the fire, even though it's cold, because the pnei shehi keboid cotton, it's considered like a small cistern, and it's considered now gemar malach. If you squeeze the olives on your flesh, as olive oil, as shmirach, that's good. The moment you gathered it in your hand, it's no longer called arai. A beautiful case. In other words, it's not about the quantity, but it's the way that you are doing it. Another din, this goes hand in hand. We spoke this out before. You can give animals any amount. Another din, you can be mafkir mehem kol mashiyirtz. You can also be mafkir any amount. No, it's prior to you being obligated to tithe it, you can be mafkir it. And once it's hefkir, it will never be mechuyev to be tithed. But if it reached the level of nigmar malachton, even though it wasn't yet nigmaru lamaised, as we are learning that if you're taking it into your house, you have to have after the gemar malacha, you have to have this kaviyos lo yafkir. Lo yafkir. V'lo yachal be'em v'chayv v'oif achilas keva at she'yaseh. Gewaltig. Another din is umuta lahachal behema arei min hatevel. Wow. Va'afilu b'teich habayis. Another din. Umachal pikei omer. A person can feed animals rolls, a straw pekalach.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, you're saying good. You're saying good. Food for a behema.
Yeah, actually, asein chavilas until you make them into large bundles. Halacha chafal. Now let's go like this. After we had all these rules, when you discover fruits on the street, so what's my kasha? First of all, it's hefker, but was it already mechuyev to be tied? And maybe it wasn't tied. So here's the rule: if you find individual shtiklach fruit, next case, if you find groigeros, you find dried figs. If most people had already crushed their figs, so we say that this product reached that stage. Similarly, if you find broken pieces of cakes of dried figs, We already said once you put them into a cake, that's already gemar malacha. Then you're chayiv to tithe it. Halacha chav beis matzah k'nichos. If you find sheaves of grain, if you find them in reshus hayachid chayiv la'aser, because it's not hefker, and that's the rule we had also on Pedig Sheni or on Pedig Krishon. Anything that's not hefker is chayiv to be tithe. But if you find them in reshus harabim, and therefore we say the owners were miyayesh beturos. Larger sheaves, if you find that that's in a smooth pile, one thing you have to tithe it, but you don't have to worry that this is trumas umaisis. You consider it tevel, so you can use this to be ma'asen for something else. If you find a basket that's covered,
in a field. If they were left off in a field, but they were left behind, would you consider that field to be?
Yes, because once it's smooth, even though the owner now is miyayesh, once the chalois hachiyuv happened while it was biyad an owner, just because you're mafked it now cannot remove the chiyuv. It's already mechuyev. The chiddush is that we assume that it's still tevel. Coming back to a basket that's covered is the gemar malacha. Yes, chayeves b'maisis. Matzak alkol. If you find a basket, if b'makim shorev machnisam lashuk, then also l'melacha aray u'mesakna demai b'makim shorev machnisam labativ. So therefore, we said before that kalkol is only gemar malacha. But if you take it home, you have to have the shisha devarim to make the kvios. It's still out. Then oichel b'm aray. But when you're mesakin it, it's vaday. Beautiful. You have to be machmer from both sides. Here another rule. Because and that's a very big klal, that truma, if a person has pebble with truma, chayv misa b'dei shamayim. Ma'aser by itself, we hadn't paid a Christian, is not holy. So people, and that's ultimately what led to the whole takanas chachamim of the Mai. People are much more careful in truma than in meiser. So once something hits gemar malacha, we assume trumas were removed. The only issue is meiser edition. Halacha chav gimel chararei hanamalim shalanu betzad ha'arema. So if you find an ant hole, you find an ant colony, and they spent at least one night near a pile of grain. Now we have to assume that every grain kernel in the anthole was removed from that pile. And therefore, if that arema was already smooth, you can't go into the anthole and just take out the grains. Because if you find olives under a olive tree, or if you find cheruvim under a carob tree, in other words, it's not hefker. If you find figs under a fig tree, why? Because since when they fall, they right away get soiled, they get ruined. So first of all, and because of the suffix, as we learned before, the final halach of this chapter, if a person consecrates produce that are already detached. Yeah, we already learned that if something is biyad hegdish when the chiyuv is chal, then it's no longer mechuyev and it will never be chayiv. But here they have the same thing. If you redeemed it before gemar malachton, that means when the gemar malachton came to be, it was owned by an individual, not a hegdish, chayiv la'aser. Aber ve'im nigmar malachton yan hegdish, and only then pedoyim pedonim anameisles. Because it's about the shas chiyuv. Shebeshas chiyuvas no yiturim. Hamagdish kama libenachos. Then the din will be tura min ha meisres gavaldik. Chevra, God willing, to be continued. That was great.